So today we're going to be breaking down a textured and dark sounding melody inside of FL Studio. For the first sound in the melody, I went ahead and grabbed this one shot called Therme, and then I ran that through the Fruity Granulizer, which is a stock plugin. So here's what that ends up sounding like. So I'll be honest here, I'm not 100% sure what Fruity Granulizer does. I just went ahead and dragged in an interesting one shot and then picked the preset called Weird Language. This gave it a super interesting texture that was really fun to work with. The only issue I had in this process was the one shot itself not being in tune, so it was playing in the wrong scale. The easiest way to fix that is just by opening that same one shot in a sampler channel and then doing Control E to open Edison. After that, you can go to this little flag marker, click on that, and then go down to detect pitch regions. After that, it'll detect all the pitch regions in the sample, and as you can see, it starts off on D sharp. So in order for this sound to be playing in tune, it has to go down 3 semitones, so it's playing a C. So after I had that figured out and the one shot was all tuned and playing in the right scale, I went ahead and created this super simple MIDI that just plays one note. Really, Fruity Granulizer is doing all of the heavy lifting here, and I just made a very simple rhythm pattern for it to go off of. Then after that, I got started on the effects. So I started off with Portal on the Pitch Artifacts preset with the mix turned down to about 15%. Then another instance of Portal on the Tape Cassette preset, again with the mix turned down to about 15%. After that, I added an EQ just to cut out some of the highs, and then finally an EQ just to cut the lows. Then after that was rendered out, I added even more effects and automation clips to get it as textured sounding as possible. So I started off with this Time Machine plugin, which is basically just a bit crusher. Then Valhalla Supermassive on the Skinny 8th preset, which is automated. Then Fruity Love Filter on the PC Low Pass preset, which is also automated. Then Fruity Chorus on the default preset with the mix turned down to about 15%. And then finally one more EQ just to cut the lows. So then hopping into the playlist to get a little bit of a closer look at the automation clips, the first thing I did was use the FL's crossfading features to add in some silent areas into the melody. So as you can see in the waveform, there's not a lot happening here, so I just wanted to fade that out and kind of add some dead space. And then what I did with the automation clips is add back in sound into that space to give a more interesting texture than what was already there. So what I mean by that is I went ahead and added a delay into that area to kind of fill it up, and again just add a little bit of a different texture. Then I layered that with the Fruity Love Filter, and again just trying to fill up this little dead area to make it sound a little bit more interesting. And then finally for the last automation clip, I just went into the sampler and changed the mode to stretch and then automated the pitch knob. After that, I went ahead and worked on a chord stack to really build out the melody. So for the first sound, I went into Analog Lab 5 Play and grabbed the Book of Memories preset, then into Keyscape and grabbed the Double Felt Grand Dry preset, then finally back to Analog Lab for the classic June Keys preset. So here's what those sound like once they're all stacked together. So then starting off with the MIDI for the pluck, as you can see, it's super simple and it's really just a 2-chord progression. If I were to go ahead and make similar chords, I'd start off by laying out the root note. So in my case, I just did D sharp since that's what I'm familiar with. After that, I would build up a basic triad. But as you can hear, we're not really getting that darker textured sound that we're really going for in this melody. So the easiest way to do that is just by pushing the middle note down. So right away, it just kind of feels a little bit more eerie. Then going off of that, I just duplicated that note up an octave just to give it a little bit more high end and a fuller chord in general. And then for the other chord in the melody, all I did was select the entire chord and do a little bit of transposing. So I went ahead and put it up 5, and then went ahead and brought the D sharp down, and then moved this A sharp to a D sharp. So then moving back to the original MIDI, you can see those same exact chords here, they're just in a different scale. After I had those chords done, all I did was do Alt-S to strum them and make it feel a little bit more human. And then also Alt-R to randomize the velocities, again, just to make it a little bit more human. And then for the effects on that pluck, I just ran it through that same double portal preset that I used for the first sound. Moving on to the MIDI for the double felt piano, again, it is very simple. This time, it just copies the bass notes of those chords, just to give it a little bit of low end, since the other chords were playing at such a high octave. Then for the effects on that piano, I started off with Fruity Chorus on the default preset, then Ferox Ferox on the total overload preset, then an EQ just to cut all the lows, and then finally Fruity Compressor on the vintage preset. Then finally for the chord stack, moving on to the MIDI for the classic June key. Again, very simple, and this time it just copies the second chord in the progression. And then yet again for the effects on that, I started off by rendering it out through that same effect chain with the double portal, but this time I did put some extra effects on it afterwards. So I started off again with this Ferox on the total overload preset, then Fruity Reverb on the default preset with the mix knob turned to about 50%, then an EQ to cut out all the lows and some of the highs as well, and then finally an Ozone Imager just to make it feel super nice and wide. Then hopping into the playlist to look at the final touches I did for those sounds. I started off on the pluck by giving it a hard cut right here where a clap would be. Again, I say this in a lot of my videos, but I think cutting things where a clap or a snare would be in the melody really just gives it a lot of bounce, and it works really well once you put drums on. Then for that classic June key, I ended up reversing that and then adding a automated EQ. So I went ahead and automated this knob right here in the EQ to control how much highs were in the melody, so now I can have a really interesting high frequency sweep and kind of build up into the next chord, which worked really well. Then moving on to the next sounds in the melody, I stacked two together to make a interesting and textured top line. So I started off with this one shot called Blues Bell, and then I layered that with a texture called Arpish. So here's what those sound like once they're combined together. So then starting off with the MIDI for the Blues Bell, again it's a pretty simple pattern, and I really just utilize slide notes to get an interesting sound. So really the easiest way to come up with patterns like this is just by clicking them by ear, so I can't really give you a concrete explanation of what I did or what I heard, because I just kind of went with what I was hearing in that time. Then I went ahead and added some effects to that before I rendered it out. So I started off with Supermassive on the default preset with the mix turned down to about 40%, then Frequency Echo with the output mode switched to mono and the shift brought down just a touch, then Hyper Chorus on the Orion's Belt preset, and then finally an EQ just to cut out some of the lows and boost some of the highs. So after I had that rendered out, I wanted to reverse it, but before I did, I ended up changing the declicking mode to smooth, so when I chopped it up, there wouldn't be any clicks or pops at each of the chops. Then finally moving on to the texture MIDI, again, it's really simple. It's just playing the same note right before a clap would hit, and I'll mention it again, but really building your melody around where a clap or a snare would hit. I just really like it. It always works well and it adds an interesting bounce. And then I did end up adding some effects to that texture, so I started off with Valhalla Supermassive on the Carousel preset, and then Portal on the Crystalline Accent preset with the mix turned down to about 25%. And then finally, I added sort of an old telephone EQ just to kind of filter the melody out slightly. Then moving on to the final two sounds in the melody besides the textures, which are the bass line. So I started off by grabbing this Jupiter bass from Vital, and then for the second one I grabbed the Boxy Moog from Omnisphere. So here's what those sound like once they're combined together. Starting off with the MIDI for the Jupiter bass, it's pretty simple, and again, it's just one of those things that I kind of clicked in by ear. Really, when I was clicking this in, I was trying to make something that kind of sounded like Million Dollar Baby, with those bass rolls that sounded really nice in that song. So in this one, I think it worked pretty well. Not as nice as in the song, but still a pretty cool pattern. Then moving on to the MIDI for the Omnisphere, again, it's pretty simple, and it just kind of fills up some of the gaps that I left in the more plucky bass. And then for the effects on those, I don't have anything on the Jupiter bass, but on the Omnisphere bass, I just threw Portal on it on the Morph Driver preset and turned the mix knob down to about 15%. And then finally for the last portion of the melody is the drum loop and the texture. Again, it's just kind of one of those things where you're hitting the down key and just listening to things until they kind of fit the melody that you've already created. So I just really searched through all the kits I have and I came up with this. And then after that, the last thing I did was render everything all together and pitch it down one. So here's what everything sounds like once it's all combined. So yeah, that's going to be pretty much it for the video. Thank you guys for watching. Again, this is the second video in a row where it's like, hey man, I haven't made a tutorial in a while, so I'm a bit rusty. Same thing applies to this one. It's a 30-minute recording when it should be like 15. But it's alright. I've been streaming a lot more, so that's cool. But yeah, pretty snazzy melody, I suppose. Yeah, that's gonna be it. Bye.